All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to today's GSU Professional Development Seminar on Oral Presentations 101. So today we have with us Ms. Teresa Merrick. She's here from the Writing Center, will be our presenter for today. Just a reminder that if you're working towards the GSU's Professional Development Certificate, you'll need to have attended at least 5 of the GSU Professional Development Seminars throughout this academic year, so from last fall and this spring combined. We have video recorded most of the seminars, so if you missed some in the fall or earlier this spring, from any that we video recorded, those are available on the GSU Professional Development website, and you can earn credit if you view those videos and do the feedback survey after watching those seminars. So after today's event, within the next few days, you'll receive a link for a feedback survey for this session. So as long as you fill out that survey, then you'll get credit for having attended this seminar. Okay, well, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Teresa.
All right. Thank you for being here today. Given the size of the room and the size of the crowd, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to, if you want to come up and join me a little bit closer, that might help us be a little bit more of a interactive group. That would be great. Hopefully some more people will show up and join us too. Thank you. Here we go. All right, so given the setting, if you have any questions or comments, things you want me to stop and take a closer look at, other topics that are related that you want to discuss, this is a good space to do so, so let me know. But I come to you from the Department of English, where I'm an instructor in professional and technical communication, and I also serve as one of the assistant directors for the Writing Center, focusing on writing across the curriculum. So that's sort of where I bring my, my point of view into the discussion. What I'm going to talk to you today about is kind of encompassing a variety of topics related to presentation skills. And so we're going to look at the various components of consideration that go into a good sort of oral presentation. So we're going to talk a little bit about audience awareness and how to figure out what your audience needs. We're going to think about how the environment that you're going to present in is going to impact the way you plan and the way you deliver. We're going to talk about how you can actually, dissect your research and prepare it for public viewing. That's always a big challenge. And then we'll have a close look at some of the visuals that are often used to support those presentation moments. So we'll talk a little bit about posters, and then we'll focus as well on some presentation slides. So that's kind of the general structure, but if you have any questions or comments along the way, there'll be some opportunities to include those. Okay, so first of all, what we typically start with when we train our students in professional communication is really figuring out who's listening on the other side. And that's going to be sort of the driving factor to all the presentations you are going to build. And so I usually encourage people I work with to ask some questions. And as you can see, some of these questions are fairly straightforward. They're not particularly complex, but it's unusual in that we often forget to ask these questions of ourselves in the first place, that we often overlook sort of the simple, who are we talking to in these moments of presentation planning. And so I encourage you, at the start of your process, when you're, have a presentation to prepare, you actually take some time to write down your responses to these things. So when you look to the listeners, the people you are going to be speaking to, I want you to think about how much you already, or they already know about your field and discipline. So what are they coming in with? What's the knowledge that they bring to the table? And how much do they already know about your topic? Sometimes the differences can be really interesting, that you might be speaking to people in your field, but not necessarily people who are familiar with your topic. And so the way you introduce your particular field of research and your particular topics of discussion can be heavily impacted by that. Sometimes you're going to be speaking to people who are outside of both of those sets, that you are talking to people from a different discipline. You're speaking to people who are members of the public, who are clients, other people who are impacted by your work. Sometimes they know nothing about your particular field of research just to begin with. But then connecting that information to the following question is really important. So what does your audience need to learn during that presentation that you will give them? What information from that is going to be new? And so being able to differentiate your content between things that might be reminders or helpful background content that will familiarize or refamiliarize your audience versus things that are going to be entirely new. And so make sure you're aware of what particular pieces of information you have to present. The other component of presentation planning is trying to figure out whether you have an action that you are going to be recommending or encouraging by the end of your presentation. That there's usually a reason why your audience is listening. And so trying to figure out what it is you want them to do by the time you're done is important to remember. So in a lot of practical circumstances in academic research, you want to pass your dissertation, you want to get a job. But then in larger research moments, your goal in these communication settings is sometimes a little bit more complex, that you want them to take your research and consider its broader impacts. You want to be able to see other implications or future applications of your work. You might want to build on connections that the audience might have to your work. And so it's important to think about particularly what types of things you want your audience to do with the information you're going to present. And so as you'll see down at the bottom here of this slide, the answers you're going to come up with will always vary, which is why I encourage you to answer these questions each and every time you have a presentation. If you're speaking at a conference or if you're speaking to your colleagues in a department seminar, though the way you plan is going to be different from more public settings where you're giving larger oral presentations or whether you are putting together a poster session. And posters are often the first time that many researchers encounter the opportunity to talk about their research outside of their department. So it's really important to think about what you're doing here. Okay, from there, what I'm going to show you a little bit is some research that talks about how your audience typically interacts with your material, because it's helpful to think about what's happening on the other side while you're speaking and to be able to play to what a typical audience does. So what you're seeing here is just a visual representation of how you are interested in your topic and kind of the depth of interest that you might possess on something that you're going to talk about versus what an audience might have. And just using that triangle to represent, a broad movement towards a specific interest in your topic. It's not surprising that you as a presenter are kind of focused on the very specific details of a topic. You're very interested, you're invested, and you spend a lot of time looking into that branch of information. Your audience, however, is kind of working from the opposite end, that they probably have a broad interest in your subject, but because they may not necessarily have explored that particular topic in depth, because they haven't been introduced to some of the information you're going to discuss, their level of interest and their depth of interest is much different than yours. And so figuring out how to kind of meet their needs can be challenging. And then if you think about how you turn that into the messaging that's going to go into your presentation, you want to sort of be able to play into sort of common ground knowledge and then bring them into the depth of the discussion that you would like them to have. And so when you are focusing on your presentation, it's important to think about messaging. That typically what you want to be doing is looking through your research and looking for those broader impacts, those central themes, findings, conclusions, impacts of your research, because that typically appeals to those in your audience, that they can really work with that and within their broad interest. The important thing to remember is that you are not expected in presentations to summarize everything about your project, everything about the years of dissertation work that you've done, that it's really about pulling out the important messages that the audience will be able to understand, enjoy, and do something with. So that's a component that you want to be able to pull out and plan for. Now the visuals, we've gotten used to the fact that presentations usually are accompanied by PowerPoint slides. And so visuals have become kind of a common component of presentations. And these things are meant to communicate high impact information and to help the audience maintain focus, that it's hard for people to listen, just to one person talking for a couple hours on end. But visuals can help reinforce the key messages. They're preferred by audiences to text, and the audience is going to be drawn to whatever is up there. That's just kind of how they work. They will always look first at a slide before they look at you. And so trying to figure out how to get these elements to work together is what you want to be considering at the start of a presentation plan. Okay, what we're going to look at here are some structures to help you get started. And the good news is that you can build a structure for your presentation that's very similar to the way you are structuring your research. So here is a basic outline using, the IMRAD structure. So you have an opportunity to do what you would do in a paper. Introduce your ideas, present your methods, discuss results, conclusions, broader impacts, or future directions. So feel free to apply that structure onto your presentations as well. So you can take that, but again, it's important to consider the way an audience is going to interact with that information in a presentation setting. So what you're going to see here is a visual representation of, again, audience interest. That what we typically find is that audiences are very engaged right at the beginning. There's a lot going on, they're very invested, and they feel like they're getting into the topic, we're just getting started, they're really excited. But you'll see from the data down here that interest really starts to drop. It plummets around the middle stages of a particular talk or discussion. And that can be a challenging moment for a presenter. It tends to go up again near the end, but that data is a little cloudy because within there, I think we're also seeing that audiences are getting excited that the presentation is almost done. And so it's not necessarily that they're excited that, by whatever it is you're saying, they're also like, this is great, I get to go home. And so being able to work with a typical kind of audience level of interest as well as attention span is really important. What that means is that your introduction or the first few minutes of a presentation is your most powerful high impact moment, and that you want to look for opportunities to add the most important information there, because they may not pick it up in the middle. They may not necessarily have it or be ready for it at the end. So the first few components of an introduction really set up the listening experience for your audience, and it's important to be aware of that. Okay, so building off of some of these common elements of presentations, we're going to think about a couple of other things. Beyond the message that you're trying to communicate, beyond the audience that you're trying to speak to, the other two really big factors in your planning should be thinking about what the visuals, if you are going to include them, should look like, as well as thinking about the speaking environment. These two things play a huge role in how you plan what you're going to talk about and what the oral discussion of your presentation will sound like and include. So I'm going to talk about a few things related to that. Okay. The big message that you're going to see in a lot of the advice I'm going to show you is that it's important to plan these elements kind of simultaneously, that they should be components you build into your planning throughout the process, as opposed to considering each of them separately. And to give you an example of that, I work with a lot of undergraduate students who typically write their PowerPoint slides first and then will kind of add their speaking notes at the end. And so those two things are built very independently. I also have students who do the opposite, that they plan their presentation in their speaking notes, and then they put those speaking notes in point form onto their slides. And basically what's happening is, because those two elements aren't being considered as working, together, but rather as sort of repeats of the same thing, the visuals lose their meaning. They lose their focus and their power. And then the oral discussion of a presentation is also not reinforced by what a visual could reinforce and provide. So making sure that you're considering all of these things throughout the planning process is key. So that's what you're going to see a mix of in the following advice, that I'm going to sort of consider a lot of these elements when giving you some suggestions. Okay, we're going to talk first about perfecting your delivery. This is where in the Writing Center we see a lot of people asking for help, where they feel like they're the least confident, that they know their research and they know their ideas. They're happy talking about it with people who are interested, but the actual delivery is what is holding them back for whatever reason. And the good news is that while some people seem to be a little bit more naturally confident about these particular moments, anybody can learn to be good at delivering a presentation, that it just is a matter of being a bit more conscious of particular strategies you can use. So none of these suggestions are going to be particularly complex. They're just things that I encourage you to, pay a little bit more attention to. It goes without saying, but it's important to practice as many times as you possibly can in front of as many people that will allow you to do so before they start to get really annoyed. Timing yourself is going to be important. We often forget to include and build in enough practice time. And so the reason I really emphasize this is because it's important during your planning stage to give yourself a buffer and to give yourself an opportunity to have all of your materials be complete so that you have additional time to go over it, practice it, make revisions to it as needed. And it's helpful to practice in front of people because it forces you to consider that audience impact, that a lot of people do kind of try and practice alone, and that can be helpful, but I do also encourage you to actually speak to an audience as your test subjects. Think really carefully about the relationship between what you're going to say and what you're going to project, that the messages should reinforce each other, but also not necessarily repeat each other. And we'll talk a little bit about that later when we think about presentation slides. One thing I often encourage my students to do is to think about ways that you can use visuals to reinforce a natural pause, movement towards another topic, a transition, and to insert something like a blank slide into their presentations. That gives you in your delivery time to stop and take a moment, to focus on how to move away to a new topic, or to have the audience really pay attention to you. That if you don't want them to be distracted and you really want them to pay attention to what you have to say, inserting a blank slide or a very simple image is a really great strategy that many good speakers employ. And then one other thing that is helpful to do as you're considering your delivery is to practice speaking more slowly than you think you're going to need to. You should sound unusually slow to yourself as you're listening. What typically will happen is you'll speed up during an actual presentation. And so you want to give yourself a little bit of room to slow down. Okay. One of the biggest pieces of advice that students seem to find the most helpful as they're building their presentations is that it's really just important to know yourself and to know that you are going to need something specific to make it work for you. That there really is no one way to go about delivering a presentation. You will look to the research and nobody's going to say you have to do it one way or the other. You have to work within a certain set of rules sometimes, sort of knowing your space, knowing how much time you have allotted. But if you feel that you speak best with a few speaking notes available to you, or if you need to write out a whole script that you can read, or if you're somebody who does better if you're allowed to be more spontaneous, those things are important to be aware of and to plan for. And so don't feel like you have to fit your presentation style into somebody else's, that you'll be more comfortable and more confident if you're working with the style that's right for you. And so maybe you haven't even had the chance to think about what works best for you. So this is also a good opportunity to, kind of feel that out and see what it is you need. The worst thing you can do in a presentation is to go over time. It doesn't matter, what setting it is, what particular moment it is, that ultimately going over time is the greatest sin of presentations. And so being able to practice so that you don't run into that in the first place, or being able to adapt in those moments where you have to speed things up or cut your content down is what a good presenter will do. And we've probably all been in circumstances where somebody is told they have maybe 1 minute left, and then they speed up their talking and they try and fit, 10 minutes of conversation into that 1 minute. That an adapter, a presenter who can adapt, will figure out how to cut down that information in the moment and make it work with the time constraints. So that's something that you want to be comfortable doing. Okay. One thing that I think is really helpful when you're getting started is to really start paying attention to good presenters in your life. And we're lucky in academia that we're often surrounded by people who have had a lot of practice with presentations. And so start paying attention to what people do well and what it is that you feel is drawing them into your conversations and what is helping you to pay attention to the topic and to understand it. I'm going to show you just a portion of a video that comes from a researcher in the field of biology. Maybe you've seen this, it's an older TED Talk. But what I'm gonna show you is the first few minutes, and I'd just like you to take it in, and we'll try and chat after about some of the techniques that you might be noticing in her speaking style and her presentation stance and some of the visuals she's using, things like that. So we'll have a look and get it to work. Seems to be a bit delayed. Just gonna see if I can get this to pay closer attention. Has anybody ever seen this TED Talk before? Cheryl Hayashi is the name of the researcher. I'm hoping I can get it to work for you. Let's play around with it for a second. What you can do with, while I try and troubleshoot some of this, if you have a presentation that's coming up, what I often do is have some people just do some quick note writing to see sort of how quickly some ideas can come down. And so if you have a presentation about your research coming up, or if you know that there's something on a topic you have to work on, are you able to summarize the particular point of your presentation in one sentence or less? That can be a big challenge. So give that a try, and I'll see if I can troubleshoot a few things for you. I think we got it. So I'm living the meta version of this presentation because this is something that is often a presenter's biggest fear is technology issues. You just got to work through it. and everybody is usually pretty kind about these things. So this is a talk by Cheryl Hayashi, and the particular topic is called The Magnificence of Spider Silk. So this is one of my favorite test subjects on presentations. So you can have a look. We'll watch a few minutes of it.
I'm here to spread the word about the magnificence of spiders and how much we can learn from them. Spiders are truly global citizens. You can find spiders in nearly every terrestrial habitat. This red dot marks the Great Basin of North America, and I'm involved with an alpine biodiversity project there with some collaborators. Here's one of our field sites, and just to give you a sense of perspective, this little blue smudge here, that's one of my collaborators. This is a rugged and barren landscape, yet there are quite a few spiders here. Turning rocks over revealed this crab spider grappling with a beetle. Spiders are not just everywhere, but they're extremely diverse. There are over 40,000 described species of spiders. To put that number into perspective, here's a graph comparing the 40,000 species of spiders to the 400 species of primates. There are 2 orders of magnitude more spiders than primates. Spiders are also extremely old. On the bottom here, this is the geologic time scale, and the numbers on it indicate millions of years from the present. So the 0 here, that would be today. So what this figure shows is that spiders date back to almost 380 million years. To put that into perspective, this red vertical bar here marks the divergence time of humans from chimpanzees, a mere 7 million years ago. All spiders make silk at some point in their life. Most spiders use copious amounts of silk, and silk is essential for their survival and reproduction. Even fossil spiders can make silk, as we can see from this impression of the spinneret on this fossil spider. So this means that both spiders and spider silk have been around for 380 million years. It doesn't take long from working with spiders to start noticing how essential silk is to just about every aspect of their life. Spiders use silk for many purposes, including the trailing safety dragline, wrapping eggs for reproduction, protective retreats, and catching prey. There are many kinds of spider silk. For example, this garden spider can make 7 different kinds of silks. When you look at this orb web, you're actually seeing many types of silk fibers. The frame and radii of this web is made up of one type of silk, while the capture spiral is a composite of 2 different silks, the filament and the sticky droplet. How does an individual spider make so many kinds of silk? To answer that, you have to look a lot closer at the spinneret region of a spider. So silk comes out of the spinnerets. And for those of us spider silk biologists, this is what we call the business end of the spider. We spend long days, hey, don't laugh, that's my life. We spend long days and nights staring at this part of the spider. And this is what we see. You can see multiple fibers coming out of the spinnerets because each spinneret has many spigots on it. Each of these silk fibers exits from a spigot, and if you were to trace the fiber back into the spider, what you would find is that each spigot connects to its own individual silk gland. A silk gland kind of looks like a sac with a lot of silk protein stuck inside. So if you ever have the opportunity to dissect an orb web weaving spider, and I hope you do, what you would find is a bounty of beautiful, translucent silk glands. Inside each spider, there are hundreds of silk glands, sometimes thousands. These can be grouped into 7 categories. They differ by size, shape, and sometimes even color. In an orb web weaving spider, you can find 7 types of silk glands. And what I've depicted here in this picture, so let's start at the 1 o'clock position. There's tubuliform silk glands, which are used to make the outer silk of an egg sac. There's the aggregate and flagelliform silk glands, which combine to make the sticky capture spiral of an orb web. Piriform silk glands make the attachment cement. That's the silk that's used to adhere silk lines to a substrate. There's also aciniform silk, which is used to wrap prey. Minor ampulate silk is used in web construction. And the most studied silk line of them all, major ampulate silk. This is the silk that's used to make the frame and radii of an orb web and also the safety trailing drag line. But what exactly is spider silk? Spider silk is almost entirely protein. Nearly all of these proteins can be explained by a single gene family. So this means that the diversity of silk types we see today is encoded by one gene family. So presumably, the original spider ancestor made one kind of silk. And over the last 380 million years, that one silk gene has duplicated and then diverged, specialized over and over and over again to get the large variety of flavors of spider silks that we have today. There are several features that all these silks have in common. They all have a common design, such as they're all very long. They're sort of outlandishly long compared to other proteins. They're very repetitive, and they're very rich in the amino acids glycine and alanine. To give you an idea of what a spider silk protein look like, this is a dragline silk protein. It's just a portion of it from the black widow spider. This is the kind of sequence that I love looking at day and night. So what you're seeing here is the one-letter abbreviation for amino acids, and I've colored in the glycines with green and the alanines in red. And so you can see it's just a lot of G's and A's. You can also see that there's a lot of short sequence motifs that repeat over and over and over again. So for example, there's a lot of what we call polyalanines or iterated A's, A. There's GGQ, there's GGY. You can think of these short motifs that repeat over and over again as words. And these words occur in sentences. So for example, this would be one sentence. And you would get this sort of green region and the red polyalanine that repeats over and over and over again. And you can have that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times within an individual silk molecule. Silks made by the same spider can have dramatically different repeat sequences. At the top of the screen, you're seeing the repeat unit from the dragline silk of a garden Argiope spider. It's short, and on the bottom, this is the repeat sequence for the egg case or tubuliform silk protein for the exact same spider. And you can see how dramatically different these silk proteins are. So this is sort of the beauty of the diversification of the spider silk gene family. You can see that the repeat units differ in length. They also differ in sequence. So I've colored in the glycines again in green, alanine in red, and the serines, the letter S, in purple. And you can see that the top repeat unit can be explained almost entirely by green and red, and the bottom repeat unit has a substantial amount of purple. What silk biologists do is we try to relate these sequences, these amino acid sequences, to the mechanical properties of the silk fibers. Now, it's really convenient that spiders use their silk completely outside their body. This makes testing spider silk really, really easy to do in the laboratory because we're actually, testing it in air. That's exactly the environment that spiders are using their silk proteins. So this makes quantifying silk properties by methods such as tensile testing, which is basically, tugging on one end of the fiber, very amenable. Here are stress strain curves generated by tensile testing, 5 fibers made by the same spider. So what you can see here is that the 5 fibers have different behaviors. Specifically, if you look on the vertical axis, that's stress. If you look at the maximum stress value for each of these fibers, you can see that there's a lot of variation. And in fact, dragline or major ampulate silk is the strongest of these fibers. We think that's because the dragline silk, which is used to make the frame and radii for a web, needs to be very strong. On the other hand, if you were to look at strain, this is how much a fiber can be extended. If you look at the maximum value here, again, there's a lot of variation, and the clear winner is flagelliform, or the capture spiral filament. In fact, this flagelliform fiber can actually stretch over twice its original length. So silk fibers vary in their strength and also their extensibility. In the case of the capture spiral,
more than you thought you wanted to hear about spider silk today. But what I'd like to do for just a minute is reflect either with somebody around you or if you'd like to kind of write some things down yourself. Observing her presentation, what did you notice about her style, and her method, the way she delivered her content, and also what did you notice about her visuals? I'd like us to pull some techniques that we seem to be observing when we take a look at this, knowing that this is a TED Talk, which has kind of become its own genre of presentation form, but I think we can learn a lot from what she is doing here. So just take a couple of minutes, reflect, or chat with some people around you, and then we'll talk all together. All right, what struck you when you had to listen to this? I would assume that most of us are coming from outside of her particular topic, unless there is a silk biologist in the room. But what did you observe as somebody who was kind of listening as an outside expert? Any techniques that you observed? Yeah, thank you.
She started with like auditory descriptions, and then she used visuals as like a support to better understand what she was saying.
Yes, lots of definitions being provided in this talk. And so she explained, trying to kind of use some accessible language, breaking down some of the more technical terms that she works with on a day-to-day basis, with the visuals in the background, breaking down that definition even further and illustrating that. So there's a lot of that happening so that we can take in and understand the particular aspects of her work. Yeah. What else did you notice? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a really logical flow of ideas. And I think she did a really good job with her use of visuals as well, because I mean, I've never felt like I was never reading too much, and most analyzing you have to do for the audience is looking at graphs, which she was verbally explaining at that point. So,
yeah, I agree. There's a lot of fantastic visual in her setup, that the role of the visuals is really to reinforce her message rather than to crowd it out. There's not a lot of text. Even when she does have visuals that include data or charts, she doesn't take the time to read every single finding or data point on it. And that tends to be something that we can fall into the trap of as researchers when we are showing a lot of data, results, tables, visualizations of your findings, that we feel a need to kind of, describe and provide every particular detail. What she did instead was highlight the most important points, and basically what should we take from this data itself. She highlighted some of the most important numbers, the things that she felt were the most useful to the discussion, but she did not run through every piece of information. And speaking to the logical flow of the content, I think she works with a rhetorical strategy that works for a lot of audiences, especially those who are an audience that's unfamiliar with your topic. And essentially what you do is you start broad, you start with the big picture, and you slowly break it down by component parts. And so she starts with the concept of exploring spiders, general information like background, location, context, all that kind of stuff, and then slowly breaks down, okay, now we want to understand and take apart this notion of the spider. What are the next largest pieces? And that's when she talks about silk. From there, she breaks it down into the different types. And then here she's breaking it down even further into the various strengths and sort of data points. And so I illustrate this with my students because a lot of my students are engineering students. And so we talk about how when they're learning about design, they are taking apart a physical object, you never see the innermost component first. You see the large component, you see the thing as a whole. And that's kind of how you want to approach a complex explanation of something in a presentation. Start with what they can see first, the more general thing as a whole, and then break it down into the next component parts. And so for my students, what that means is when they bring in a toaster that they have to take apart and analyze, they talk about the toaster as a whole first. And then the next thing they do is they take off that outer shell, the plastic shell covering. And from there, you can see the next largest components. Eventually, you can get down into those tiny pieces, but you have to start with the larger parts first, because that's typically how we as listeners process the information as well. And I think that she does that pretty nicely. Any other things that you noticed? Other comments about visuals, about her delivery? Are you aware at all of what preparation goes into TED Talks? Have you heard a little bit about how speakers typically prepare? Essentially, what speakers have to do is script their content down to like each word, each the and everything. And they have to rehearse it down to the second. And so that can be challenging for presenters because not all of us feel like we can script ourselves to that depth and that degree. But also it can often leave us with a feeling of being stunted, like it can't be dynamic and it can't be natural. The reason I love her talk is because she doesn't really sound like she is fully scripted. She sounds like she's naturally working with the audience. She sounds like she's anticipating when they might laugh about something. She sounds like she's having a conversation. And that's coming about because she's rehearsed so effectively, because she knows about her topic and is passionate, and passion typically comes through if you let it. Your enthusiasm will come through. But the other component is that she is rehearsed enough to a level that she's comfortable with the structure she's working with. And so if you feel like you're a presenter who struggles with either script or a very specific structure to your presentation, it's practice that might help you actually get out of that. And so it kind of sounds like the opposite of what will occur, but you might sound actually more off the cuff by rehearsing a script in more and more depth and rehearsing it more and more times. And I think she's a good example of that. So anyways, pay attention to the speakers you like, start watching presentations, start paying attention to the techniques that speakers here on campus are employing, because there are things that you can either adopt or even think about employing in your own presentations as you plan. And I feel like that's one of the best ways to see the variation of styles that can still make up a good presentation. There really is no one way to do it. Okay, I'm gonna go back to my slides here. And we're going to pick up the discussion and talk about a few other elements. So I'm going to talk first about some visuals. Okay. As I mentioned before, visuals have kind of become a standard. And we almost expect that when we give a presentation, what that means is we develop PowerPoint slides. And it's become such a natural thing that what we notice is that PowerPoint is losing some of its depth and focus, that it's becoming the thing we have to do, and therefore we kind of rush through it or do it at the last minute. Sometimes we use our PowerPoint slides and our visuals as speaking notes, but the visuals have so much power to convey the messaging, even without the oral reinforcement that you might provide. So what I have are a couple of examples, just so we can start thinking about the way that visuals are communicating to us. From this image, can you try and tell me what you feel the main takeaway message from this poster would be?
Light rail network would be better than subway.
Yeah, this is essentially light rail is better than a subway. Light rail is better, we want that one. So let's talk about how the visual design is emphasizing that. What is it about what you're seeing that's making that message clear? Mm-hmm.
The numbers on the bottom, as well as the dense lines on the graphic,
Mm-hmm.
right, left or right.
So using visuals to show more versus less, higher costs, lower costs, things like that. So these are deliberate choices by the designers to convey the particular type of information that they want you to see. Now, to give you a little bit more context, because I feel the environment here is important, these were visuals that were put up on posters in public spaces around the city where I'm from. So you were meant to see these as you were walking by on your way to work. You know, you're not really spending a ton of time looking at all the details, but you certainly in those few seconds as you're looking at it are meant to walk away with a message. And it sounds like that's what we've got. Now, because of the small time frame that the audience has to take in that visual, which is very similar to the few seconds that we often take in a slide in a presentation, we can use the visual design to emphasize certain things, but also to kind of hide certain things or de-emphasize. I'm using hide in a way that might be more negative than it's actually meant to be. But looking at this visual again, is there anything in the visual design that might be making some things appear more closely to you than others? Or to rephrase it, maybe what are you not meant to see or pay too much attention to?
The total cost,
Yes, which is what?
quite a bit higher.
Yes.
for the one.
So when we walk by, we see the side-by-side setup, we see clear differences in the numbers, 334 million versus 111. Clearly that looks more expensive, but the metric, which is still provided, it's not that it wasn't included, is cost per kilometer. But the text is smaller, so we're not meant to pay as much attention to that. And we're left sort of realizing, if we take a closer look, that if we're talking about, you know, several kilometers more of light rail, it's going to cost a lot of money, even though the number and the visual design of those pieces of information are not necessarily showing you that initially. Anything else that you're noticing that also might be kind of masked or hidden due to the visual design? It might also be because you, from where you're sitting, you might not even be able to see it in the setup. There's some gray text underneath the words Torontonians served. It's hard to see from a distance. What that is doing is providing some additional context as to what those numbers on the bottom mean. So again, walking by them side by side, we see so many more people served by the light rail plan than by the subway plan. But those numbers are coming from somewhere, and they've calculated them according to the gray text by thinking about the number of people living and working within a 6-minute walk or 500 meters of the proposed lines of light rail or subway. Now, I mean, that is a metric. However, it's not necessarily the best metric to attribute to people who are actually going to use the system every day. That subway commuters, people who use the subway system, tend to not live, you know, within a 6-minute walk. They might be coming in from various other parts of the suburbs or the outside of the city. And so it's a metric that serves light rail more than it serves the subway system. So again, this is a design issue, that the information is all here for you to take a look at, but because of the way it's set up, the visuals are helping you to look at certain things and not at others. Now compare that one to this one and tell me what you think. What's the message here? This was also a visual that posted, you know, sides of buildings, bus station stops, things like that. Yeah.
It's like, look at our city versus everybody else who's much more progressive, I guess, or has much more lines.
Mm-hmm. So in this case, we have no text. The visuals are meant to draw comparisons. You're looking at the subway maps for each city, and you're meant to be able to see, well, compared to all of these other cities, Toronto's really falling behind. If we want to be a world-class city, then we need to invest in our subway system. But again, there are choices being made here in terms of showing you what they want you to see. So what is not being represented or being, you know, de-emphasized in the way that the visual is designed?
The size of the city.
Mm-hmm. Size, population, scale, all the data that really helps us to compare these things side by side. And when you have that information, you can make the case that Toronto is not in the same kind of depth as these other cities, much lower population, different area size, different number of people who use these systems every day. But that's not what you're meant to focus on. It's information that they can provide you with, but the visual itself is trying to emphasize a different message. So I'm using these just as a way to help you think about, the choices that you have to deliberately make about which information you're showing to your audiences. And you always want to aim for accuracy. You want to aim for academic honesty. We have an ethical responsibility with what we convey, but there are ways that design helps us as audiences to pay attention to certain things, and we have to be aware of that power when we utilize it. So thinking about that, what I want to run down for you are some particular suggestions for visual design and sort of working with your visuals in different settings. And so the first one I'm going to do here is to talk about how poster presentations are going to work, because typically you're going to spend several hours standing next to a visual, and your interaction with that is how you are going to work with people who come by. Many of you have probably had the opportunity to experience sort of the poster session and the chaos and all the fun of that, and we can sort of draw from those experiences later on if you want to chat about it. But the important thing is you're thinking about the planning stage of a poster session, both for your content delivery when you have conversations with people, but also how you're going to build that messaging behind you with your poster, is to always be designing with that experience in mind. That a poster session at a conference is unlike any other. They're always stuck in the noisiest corridors of the hotel where you're staying. They are people passing by, people are eating their lunch on the way through. It's not the quiet, focused sessions that you see in other elements of a conference. And so you have to be aware of that. The other thing is that readers are going to be standing somewhat away from your posters at first, and it's from there that they decide whether they want to come in and take a closer look. Otherwise, they might glance at things and pass by. And you still want to work with that audience as well. That even those who are not going to come up to you and have a chat are taking in information and might follow up with you later. So you want to build your visual with that audience as well. Capturing that audience from a distance, you also have to be aware that you may not have the opportunity to reinforce your messaging with a discussion. So the oral content of a poster session is de-emphasized in that way, that sometimes you have a great conversation with people who are interested, but the majority of the people that are going to see your work are seeing the visual first. And that always has to be taken into account. So with that, kind of like I emphasized before, a poster is meant to be selective in its messaging. You're going to organize your work around a central theme, a thesis, a finding, or a message. That it's not the place where you display every aspect of your research projects. And being able to design both your discussion and your visual with that particular message will help you to make decisions about what to include and what not to. With that, it's also helpful to know when you have a lot of things to say, how much space physically you actually have. And so you can reduce some of the nerves associated with poster sessions by becoming really aware of what your environment is going to look like and what amount of space you are going to have. So knowing your dimensions, what particular size board you're going to have to put up things, know the materials that will be given to you, whether it's something like having a table to put up a poster, or it's going to be posted up on a wall, if you have a chair where you'll be able to sit down, or if you're meant to stand. All of these things are important to be aware of. And conference organizers are usually happy to provide that information to you if these things are a particular source of concern. Knowing those things ahead of time will help you to plan. You want to choose visuals that are going to emphasize your message and reduce text clutter. That the majority of good posters are somewhat minimalist in their approach. They try and keep things simple and try not to put too many pieces of data onto, one size of a poster. The important thing with visuals in a poster setting is that because you don't have the opportunity to talk through the connections of your ideas, like we saw with Cheryl Hiyashi's talk, you have to represent those relationships visually. And so that's why posters typically employ a lot of annotations, things like arrows, text boxes that move you through one section of a poster to the next to really show how ideas are related to each other. So you can think about the way you would connect ideas in a conversation and try and represent those things on a visual perspective on your poster. And that will help those who may not get a chance to talk to you to see how to move through your material. Always keep your audience knowledge in mind. They will likely need more background information, more definitions than you do. And so it's important to include those in particular places, somewhere on your poster or somewhere around you if you have handouts, things that you can provide. Familiarize yourself with what your field expects. And one of the best ways I find for learning that is to take a walk through campus and look at the various posters on display. They look very different in architecture than they do over in biology. Making sure that you are aware of what happens in your field will help you to plan as well. There are lots of templates available online, so you don't have to invent things from scratch. It's perfectly acceptable to utilize those templates as long as they are meeting the dimensions that you are working with as well. One of the most important pieces of real estate in your messaging in these sessions is your title. And so you want to choose a title that's going to accurately represent your research and your findings, but that is also meant to draw your readers and your spectators in. And so thinking about how a title can convey importance, action, or broader impact can be very, very helpful. So we're starting to hear how your oral delivery, how your visuals are starting to interact, especially and how they are impacted by your audience and the environment that you're working with. We're going to sort of add a few more discussions about how to prepare for the times when you do get to chat with somebody. So some tips for those types of presentation moments is to be prepared to have several versions of your presentation. And so what you're looking for are the audiences that will chat with you for 20 seconds. And in those cases, you're building a 15 to 30 second elevator pitch of your work. So this is the really, really condensed version of your talk where you focus just on the key messages. Other people who are a bit more interested might ask for a quick summary of your key methods and findings. So those are audience members that might be a little bit more aware of your field of research. And so they're interested in what you did that was different from what others in the field might be doing. And so be prepared to have a presentation that speaks to those things as well. In that case, you may have a few minutes, but you also want to kind of feel what an audience is expecting, what somebody you're talking to is doing. If they seem like they're itching to move on, you would adapt for that as well. The other big thing to be aware of is that many people observing posters and poster sessions are people who would have broader relation to your work, who could fund you in the future, or who could take your work and apply it to other areas. And so having another presentation prepared that talks about broader impacts, this is the big so what of your presentation, will speak to their needs as well. Try to anticipate questions that readers might have about your poster content and prepare some answers ahead of time. And so this is a good opportunity to test with some friends. What would you ask after looking at this visual? And in your presentation planning, you can sort of have some answers prepared for that. And again, as I mentioned in the past, but I will say it again, practice speaking these little sessions more slowly than you think you need to. In a loud and noisy conference poster session, you're going to have to talk loud. And so it's important to slow down as well, just so that people can process information amid all the noise that's going to be going on in the background as well. Okay, before I move on to a discussion of other types of settings, do you have any questions about presenting in a poster moment? Mm-hmm.
If there's like judges versus people, what are like some topics that you should highlight with the judges, like as a summary?
That's a good question. So thinking about what judges are looking for, they will usually be giving you more time to walk through each component of your poster, in that you will get a chance to do a more complete talk, but you will often be limited to a certain time frame. So first, being aware of how much time that is. It might be a couple of minutes that they'll come by and chat with you. So working with that time frame, but being prepared to focus on a walkthrough of your work that's going to remember, kind of like I showed you in the previous graph, that the information you present at the beginning is going to be one of the most important moments. So in the beginning, you talk about the overall findings, impact, sort of the big whys of your research and why things matter. From there, you can go down into the various aspects of your research, your methods, your findings, and things like that, and then bring back that conversation to the broader impacts once again. So why things matter, why things are important, And so again, sort of drawing your conclusions in a way that's going kind of reaching back out to your broader community would be really important. But again, it's very similar to a typical research discussion in that you have a couple of minutes to walk through all of the components typically and to move through the information in the way that a typical research presentation would do. Okay, so what we're going to talk about next are presentation slides, and this is where we get into kind of the more dominant things that we utilize in various presentation moments. They follow very similar strategies that you have to be aware of. The important thing to really consider is why the slides are there, and they're really there to emphasize your take-home message. And so, you know, the audience is there listening to you. They want to find out, you know, what your research is about. They're typically a friendly audience, but they need slides and visuals in a lot of settings to reinforce those things and to keep them on track. And so to help them along with that, slides should be there to introduce and emphasize the big messages at the beginning, to keep reminding them of the main messages somewhere in the middle, and then to reinforce that message at the end. And so it's important that presentation slides are built around supporting the audience and remembering the big picture stuff and not just helping them to break down the really complex things that you can't talk about orally. Designing the slides for the audience is also something that it sounds very straightforward and simple, but that we often overlook. That one of the most common pitfalls of slide design is that they have been designed to be your speaking notes and not to be visuals that are helping the audience to remember your content. And so try using those slides as ways to emphasize or further kind of talk about key messages or to help them remember things that you're reinforcing verbally as well. Think about the ways that the titles of your slides can really be used in ways that matter. That we typically work with standard headings in these designs, you know, using introduction, results, conclusions, very descriptive type titles. But one of the researchers I'm going to point you to in a few minutes has talked about how because this is such a prime piece of real estate on our slides, this is where our eyes are drawn to, this is a great opportunity to convey messaging and to convey meaning. And so if you take out general introductions, general types of headings that are largely descriptive, and think about how you can convey a message to your audience in the titles, you'll help your readers typically follow along a little bit better. And I'll show you a few examples of that a little bit later. Think very carefully about how much text a slide contains. My slides for a lot of these presentations tend to be my most text-heavy ones, mostly because I used to do more visual ones, and then I would get requests after the fact for people wanted my speaking notes. So I put a lot of them up here so that they don't have to do that. But this is kind of a lot of text for people to process. And so thinking about how those slides should be the exception and not the rule is really important. You want to avoid having too much for people to process that's going to take away from their focus on you. If a slide is containing a lot of text, build time into your planning to have them take in that information. Your slides should be visually interesting. They should have a reason for existing, and they shouldn't just be there because. And so looking for, you know, evidence and visuals in your research that you can illuminate up on a slide can be really helpful. And oftentimes you'll find that when you are describing something complex, that it's much easier to include a visual of that thing than it is to break it down and explain it. So those are great moments to utilize your slides. Your presentation software is going to have a really big impact on how your presentation will look. PowerPoint has really become the default, but there are still those other options out there. If you are a Keynote user, it has a particular look that's very similar to the whole Apple aesthetic. If you are a Prezi user, it's somebody who's comfortable with the overall purpose of Prezi, which is to represent a lot of visual relationships. All of these things have their advantages and disadvantages. I, for one, get kind of motion sick when I see Prezi presentations just because they, you know, pan in and out and they move around a lot. Whereas PowerPoint is a bit more standard. People tend to utilize that. So if you are verging into different types of software, just know that your audience is going to interact with it differently. And it's important to be aware of what's typically acceptable. PowerPoint is usually your default if you're unsure. Be aware of what options are out there in your field. And so again, I see Prezi and Keynote used in other sort of business settings, in more relaxed settings. I see more PowerPoint in more academically focused settings. So it's important to kind of be aware of that. Okay. Just to kind of illustrate what slide design can do and what impact it has, I want to briefly walk you through an example that has received a lot of attention in the industry. Perhaps you have seen it before. Does anybody recognize the information on this slide? I realize how long ago this was now when I start presenting this. This is a slide that is talking about the testing and the research that was being done in 2003, right after the Columbia shuttle went into orbit. And while they feared that there was some particular damage done during takeoff that might prevent re-entry from being safe. And so during this time, NASA asked Boeing to put together some tests, to run some data, and to kind of give them a presentation on what they felt the risks were. And ultimately, NASA was trying to figure out, is it okay if we have the shuttle attempt re-entry? Do we need to do anything before that moment? Or is the damage contained enough, insignificant enough, that we don't need to worry too much about it? If it is, what do we need to do? So this is one of the actual slides from Boeing's presentation, and it's become one of the most famous case studies in PowerPoint research because many people have looked at it and said, this is the classic misuse of PowerPoint, where we overwhelm our audience with too much data. We rely on the point form structure that PowerPoint kind of pushes at you when you first open up the software. And we're not thinking about how a lot of information, especially to an unfamiliar audience, is really hard to process from a visual standpoint. And so a lot of researchers have suggested that this style of presentations was what misled NASA to believe that the shuttle could land safely, when in fact the information being presented here is suggesting that a spacewalk was required to inspect all the damage that had occurred, and that they needed to do something before they attempted re-entry. So there were a lot of other decisions going into this process, but a lot of focus has been placed on these particular presentations and this slide in particular as a way to demonstrate that the visual of a presentation has a lot of power to persuade readers of messages that you may not intend. And so thinking about that and how our software in PowerPoint has changed to allow for, I think, easier messaging since 2003 is helpful. There are ways that you can take what used to be this very heavy master style that pushed you towards point form, and that still does in its current setup, and think a little bit more about what happens on a PowerPoint slide. That you're typically asked to include a title in large text, so it has a lot of power. So you want to think carefully about what you do there. The default organization of PowerPoint is in point form or levels. That's not necessarily the best way to talk through information. The size of your screen can limit the amount of technical depth that you can convey. And a lot of researchers have suggested that PowerPoint's cognitive style is just not conducive to technical presentations. So there's been a lot of talk in the news about various corporations that basically say don't use PowerPoint anymore. I know Amazon went through a time where their meetings had banned PowerPoint from their discussions. A lot of academic settings still require this, however. And so I think the message here is to think about how you can utilize PowerPoint slides effectively. So one of the ways that people have taken this other slide here and tried to think about how you can visually represent the same information in a way that's easier to digest is to think about how you can use the basic features of PowerPoint to convey the message you want. And if you're not paying attention to the particular needs of a certain situation, your PowerPoint slides are where you can lead people astray the most. And so in this particular setting, this presentation happened in a pretty time-sensitive moment. The key decision makers at NASA were not present, and so they were receiving messages secondhand from those in the audience who were able to listen. And so ultimately what people have suggested is that they just weren't using the slides for that particular moment. What they could do is something like this. So this is a revised slide using PowerPoint that takes the same information and tries to represent it in a way that's a little bit more easily digestible. So in this case, hopefully it's a little bit more clear as you're taking a glance at it what was actually being discussed. We have three sets of data that were used by Boeing to make some predictions. And they walk you through what each one of them is. So they give you some keywords and some definitions so we know what the sets of data contain. We see the findings more clearly, and we have conclusions that are titled and that we can draw conclusions for each one. And so ultimately, we have a better means of digesting and processing the information, even though there's a lot of text on this slide. And so thinking about data placement and content placement is really important at making sure your messages are coming through clearly. What I often recommend to PowerPoint builders is that they start with blank slides rather than build with the templates that they have, because then you have to make choices each and every time you place a piece of information on that page. And that can usually help you to work through the default structures that PowerPoint pushes you towards and use the space for your own messages. From there, you can go back to the templates and use them a bit more effectively, but sometimes starting with a blank one works best. So from there, what you want to think about is ways that, like this revised slide does, you can capitalize on typical rhetorical patterns or tools. In this case, we saw the scientific method to help audiences move through and process conclusions and information. Use visual structures to compare information, to draw contrasts, or to emphasize key points. And so these text slides can be very productive when they're used carefully and effectively. Making sure that there's always a conclusion that people can draw from the slide. And whenever they see lots of data, making sure you always tell them what that data means is really important on a slide itself. Okay, so if you are somebody who struggles or would like some additional help with the slide design component of your presentations, I highly recommend Michael Alley. He is somebody who has several pieces of information on his website about slide design, but he also has several books in publication that talks about a particular style of slide design that seems to work for audience comprehension. He himself focuses a lot on scientific presentations, but I think the principles he describes can work for all topics. But what he tries to advocate for is a slide design that builds presentations around key messages rather than around general topics, and supports those messages with visual evidence. And his slide design style is what Cheryl Hayashi used. And just to show you what they look like, here's one example. The title at the top is a full sentence that conveys a message. And then the visual data of support is underneath it. And so rather than having a general title at the top like findings, we take this opportunity to present and discuss the specifics of those findings right here. And it tends to work really well for reader comprehension. And so I encourage this as a great way in particular moments of your presentations to emphasize really important pieces of data that are coming out of your research. You don't have to employ this style all the time, but when you have something very important to say, this is a really great way to set it up, and it will reinforce whatever you are talking about really nicely. Here's another example of that. So again, very simple, kind of minimalist style, but the title at the top is being used to convey a finding. And Ali typically works in a full sentence. You don't have to, but it works pretty well here. So early detection methods can identify small tumors and therefore improve survival rates of patients. So it's interpreting the data for you so that you don't have to draw your own conclusions. Okay, we can kind of move through these things here, see how small things can be changed and still be effective. Okay, I'm going to start wrapping things up, and if you have more that you want to discuss about each various topic, I'm happy to wait around and we can chat about it further. But I think the ultimate take-home message I want to convey here is that we tend to get really nervous about the oral delivery of our presentations, and one of the best ways to account for that and to be more confident in our speaking is to think about the other components that we should be considering along the way. that we should always be designing with our audience in mind, that the visuals we create should be reinforcing what those messages are, and so we should build them together. We build our oral content at the same time that we build our visuals, and that all of those things should be prepared to work with the environment that you're going to be speaking in. And if you can sort of think about all of these things working together, typically the nerves that are often associated with the oral delivery are at least tamed a little bit. They never go away entirely, but at least they're things that you can manage and be a bit more confident in accounting for in the actual presentation moments. But if you have any questions or if you would like additional help, I just wanted to end with a reminder that the Writing Center can be a resource for this type of planning. We tend to think of the Writing Center only for like written reports and those types of things, but we are happy to help you work through a presentation that you have to build. And so you can bring your notes, or you can bring your poster design or your slides. You can rehearse a talk with us if you like, and we're happy to give you some feedback and some pointers that can help you with your own individual delivery. And so our information is there. You can also find us by looking us up on the Writing Center website. But thank you for listening. Because of the time that we have, if you would like to stick around and ask questions, that's great. But you also feel free to contact me if I can help you with your own presentation planning. Thank you.